Hello! In this audio blog we're going to talk about parents who parent differently. And what I mean by that is parents who parent in a different way to one another. And so from a child's perspective, they have parents who parent them differently. This is something that I often hear about when people are thinking about separation or going through a separation or after a separation. I often hear, well, we do things very differently to one another, and that might be whether they're thinking about an entire parenting approach or specifically discipline or routine or food or activities or screen time. It can be a real issue for parents when they think that the other parent is doing things very differently. And I think the underlying concern is that children will struggle to have either parents who parent differently or, from one parent's perspective, a parent who doesn't do it right or makes bad decisions or certainly does things in a very different way. In fact, when I said that I hear it from parents who are contemplating separation, it can be a reason why parents stay in relationships for as long as they do, because when everyone is living under the same roof, there can be a certain amount of supervision of how the other parent is parenting, a certain amount of mediation. You know, if one parent gets very cross very quickly and you're concerned about the impact of that on your child, being present and being able to sort of step in and shield your child from it can be a really big factor in whether or not you want to separate, or just diluting the impact of one parent's parenting. If you're all under the same roof and one parent has a tendency to serve a type of food or food group more than you might agree with, literally, if you're under the same roof, you might be able to, shove some carrots or peas on the same plate, or whatever it is that you're concerned about. And so, as I say, I think people do stay in relationships longer than they might otherwise, especially when there is a big difference in how the parents tend to parent. But when parents do separate, it becomes more of a live issue. And it can be a really big concern for parents who are newly living apart. And that might be because the relationship's broken down, and the reasons that relationship is broken down sort of compound your feelings about them as a parent. If they have let you down as a partner, it might be harder to trust them as a parent. Or just the feelings of frustration or anger towards them at leaving the relationship, or the way that they left the relationship, again, may make those feelings about them as a parent feel more intense. As I said before, it may be because you can't supervise, and if your child is spending time with the other parent away from you, you may have very little knowledge of what's going on in that house, and there may be an element of guesswork. If you've been a very involved parent, it might be the first time, it probably will be the first time that you've been away from your children for extended periods of time. And aside from professional childcare, maybe it's the first time anyone is taking care of your child and feeding them and bathing them and putting them to bed other than you. And finally, it may be that following separation, the parenting differences actually do become bigger. The difference becomes wider. The parenting approaches may become more extreme. When you're not in a relationship with your child's other parent, you may not need to pander to them and their differences in parenting. So it may be true, it may not just be a matter of perception or your own feelings, but it may be true that, finally a parent who has wanted to parent their child differently, when they have their own house and their own time alone with the child, they really lean into that, and they do. So it's a common concern, but there are things that you can do about it, and that's what this blog's going to talk about. It's going to have an activity, things that you can actually do by yourself, or with your other parent, with your child's other parent. A way of thinking about things that may result in a sort of emotional or mindset shift that helps. And then I'll end with some practical tips when there is a big difference in parenting approaches, and what you can do about it. So the activity that I suggest you start with is to cast your mind back to when you were in a relationship with your child's other parent, and when you were talking about having children, and what it was about that person that you thought that you would be able to parent well together. If you see, this doesn't apply if the pregnancy and child wasn't intentional at the beginning, but when you decided to continue and have a child together, what was it about them that you thought, yeah, we can do this together? If you ever did. You may have thought, I can do this alone, and you will feel like you're doing that now. But if you cast your mind back and think about when your child arrived, if there was a period after your child was born that you were living in the same house or in a relationship with one another, or even if you were never in a romantic relationship nor ever living together. But the big question is, what were your shared family values? I don't mean this in terms of family of origin or what, people experienced in their birth families. But what I mean is, as you as parents, what values did you both agree on? Now, if things are tricky between you as parents right now, it might feel like zero. It might feel like we never had anything in common. We both have very different views on how to parent, and that was clear from the day one. But that's rare. In most of the families that I've worked with, despite conflict, issues, allegations, things that have come later, there was a period where both parents were agreed on some values. Now, values is quite a sort of big word, and it might not resonate for some people. But what I mean by this is, what did you value for your child? So in terms of, was it academic success? Was it sociability and friendships? Is it travel or languages or sports or arts, music? And it may not be something that you ever talked about, but if you have a look back and look at things that maybe you invested in as a baby classes or after school classes, or chose a school for those reasons, or perhaps you lived abroad and perhaps you regularly saw family and friends, then normally we can come up with a list, it might be a short one, of things that both of you value for your child. Now, once you've done that activity, it may well be more fruitful to do it together, so that you can both agree, but you can do it by yourself. And once you've got that list, what I would challenge you to do is have a look at how those values are being represented in your child's life now. So if languages was a thing, do they have language tuition? And then drill down, is that language tuition being supported by both parents? Is one parent paying and the other parent facilitating it? Is one parent speaking that language at home with the child while the other parent facilitating tuition or learning themselves? So if you can find how those values are being supported in your child's life now, then you might be able to find ways in which they could be even more. And the importance of this is that for children, there can be great comfort in there being consistency in two ways. One, consistency between before the separation and after. So if a child knows that both parents were invested in them speaking foreign languages before the separation, and that has continued post-separation, that can be incredibly reassuring. But also, secondly, consistency in the approaches between the parents. Now, if this is a situation where the child experiences parenting from both parents very differently, being able to see a consistent approach in one area. So even if one parent's very lax and relaxed and the other parent's much more sort of diligent and determined, if they are both supporting the acquisition of foreign languages, and that the child can see that there is a consistent approach between the parents in some way. So that's the first activity I wanted to share. And now the next section are just a couple of things to think about and feel and think about. Both of these come from real life conversations I've had with parents who are separated from their child's other parent. And it might be a different perspective for you. So the first one is to say to you that there always were differences between the two of you or more as parents. That is because it doesn't matter how similar we are to other people. In parenting, there are so many decisions every day, week, month, year. There is not going to be one other person on this earth that would do exactly the same thing as us in every situation. So, you know, I've got friends who have got children very similar ages to me, live in a very similar place, but, you know, we have differences in approach. And that can be very reassuring for people who are newly separated to remember. The whole co-parenting thing, parallel parenting, double parenting, whatever, parenting after separation can feel entirely new and can feel like you're going to have to learn it all and do a whole new thing. But if you remember that your child has been parented by you and their other parent, and that will have been in different ways to one another since they were born, then that will remove some of the anxiety about going into this new stage. And the second thing to think about in terms of perspective is to consider whether there are any benefits of your child having parents with different approaches. And this was again another parent who spoke to me who struggles with their child's other parent having different approaches and making different decisions to the ones they would, and doing things differently. But actually there was a scenario where the child was having an issue at nursery, and the parent that I was working with said, I would never want to have gone up to nursery and made a fuss. I never would have wanted to kick up an issue, but I was quietly concerned. And the child's other parent said, I'm not happy about this. I'm going to go and talk to nursery about it, and I'm going to get something done. The parent who I was working with said, actually, I'm really glad that he did things differently that way, and that his approach of being a bit more confrontational, a little bit less trusting, and just not being worried about kicking up a fuss actually benefited our son, because in that situation he was advocating for the son in a different way to the way that she would have, but in a way that she was able to see the benefits of. So to end up this audio blog, I'm just going to share some practical tips for situations when there are differences in the way that the child is parented between homes. So the first thing I'd ask you to do is ask, is this a problem for my child or children? Or is it mainly a problem for me? If it's the latter, you can do some work on that. Find someone to talk to, professional, personal. Do some reading, do some thinking. See if you can process that. But if it's a problem for your child and they struggle with adjustments, or it's raising things that they need to talk about, or behavioural issues, the first and most simple thing to do may be to acknowledge the differences with your child. Now, this doesn't mean that saying we do it right at this house and at the other house they do it wrong. You don't have to make the child pick or judge the other parent, but you could just acknowledge it and say, I know that at your other mum's house you go to bed later, but as you know, at my house we go to bed at 6, and that's always the case when you're with me. And it's all right that people do things differently. And that can be a really important life lesson, that there isn't necessarily one right way, and that there can be multiple right ways. Another tip is to look for things that can be consistent between the houses. So even where parenting is different and lots of features of the child's life are different, if the child has 2 of the same teddy, so that the thing they cuddle at night is the same between 2 houses, that might be a strong message of consistency. Or if a child has 2 copies of the same book, so that even if they go between the 2 houses, they can carry on reading the chapters that they left off, that when they finished reading at the other parent's house. Also, if your child is struggling with the transitions, there you can look at creating consistency in the way those transitions happen. It's quite common that families might have a few transitions a week, and one might happen in the mornings of a weekend, one might happen after a school pickup, and one might happen, at some after school club or something like that. And actually, if the transitions are proving difficult, having the transitions happen at the same location, same time of day, same parent doing the travel, that might create a sense of security for the child. And finally, if none of these things can be done and a child is returning into your home having had a very, very different experience with their other parent, then something you can do, and this doesn't need anyone else's input to do, is to create a regular routine following the transition, so that the child can expect a consistent thing to happen. So again, this is easier to do if the handovers are happening at the same time of day and same location. But even if they don't, if every time your child comes back from their other parent's house, you guys go and get hot chocolate, whether it's at home or cafe or wherever, or you sit for half an hour and read a book, then that can start to create a bit more ease for the child in navigating these 2 different parenting styles. So I hope that's given you some things to think about. It's a very common situation for a child to have parents who parent differently. It doesn't need to be an innately negative thing, and hopefully some of these tips can turn it into an even more positive thing. Take care.